let's talk about what we've covered so far. In the first lecture, we saw that Western full categories of emotion are not types. They're not natural kind categories by any definition, but they're really populations of highly variable instances. Variation in this variation is not random, it's structured as signals inside you and around you are interacting. So in other words, instances of emotional emerge as relational events. In the second lecture, we discussed that these intrinsic brain signals, more specifically, you could think of them as ongoing situated categories that are being constructed continuously by the brain. Now, traditionally, philosophers and scientists have assumed that categories are in the world, concepts are in your head, and you retrieve a concept to assign a new entity or instance to their rightful category. So you're categorizing them. But our best understanding of brain function, or at least my best understanding of brain function, dissolves these boundaries. Categories, concepts, and instances basically all result from the same process. And meaning making in the brain starts by constructing a situated category as an ensemble of signals that share functional features with the present signal pattern. And the result of this process of comparing signals from the sensory surfaces to signals in the brain results in an instance of something. So it's not like instances exist and you categorize them. By virtue of category construction, you are basically constructing instances. In the second lecture, we discussed more explicitly that categories are basically signal events where the signals that your brain is constructing share some kind of functional feature with what's going on in the present. So categories and their instances, or the categories and the instances that they give rise to are relational. In the third lecture, we consider some of the basic computational details of category construction from the standpoint of predictive processing, as I understand it. The idea, again, is that a category begins with predictive regulation of the body, and it results or ends in the mental features of experience. So what you do and what you experience are always rich in relational meaning. Allostasis, skeletal muscular movements, mental features, these all could be understood as the products of predictive processing, which describe the nature of relational meaning, what happens when signals interact with each other and constrain each other. And so relational meaning is what I really want to talk about today. That when the brain is interacting, when the signals in the brain interact with signals from the sensory surfaces, and we talk about signals being compressed or decompressed and features being constructed, these features are the description of relational meaning. And this is a perspective that I have called relational realism. And in this final lecture, this is what I want to consider. And particularly what I want to consider is the implication that reality itself may be relational. So I'm not saying that reality exists only in your head. This is not an example of idealism. I'm not saying that there are many realities that are possible or all equally true. I am also not taking a logical empiricist stance that there's a reality out there in the world, but all we can know of that reality out there in the world is what we can sense. Nor am I suggesting, as many predictive processing research accounts do, that this objective reality exists out there separate from us, which we can only ever know in a biased way filtered through the veil of our own beliefs. Instead, what I'm suggesting here is that there is one reality that is inherently perspective dependent and flexible, although not infinitely flexible. Perspective dependent here means that objects and events and the features that describe them and their causal impacts and the categories that they belong to exist only in relation to something else. And much of the time, that something else are the signals in you. You. Did I mention that I was finishing this talk in the car this morning, so my apologies if it's not as practiced as all the others. So here's the general idea. Reality consists of signals. I've used this word before, but here I want to try to define it more precisely for you. A signal in engineering is simply any quantity that varies in time and space. It's a really general definition. So it's a different way of defining a signal than we do in psychology, where a signal is usually used to denote meaningful information, which is the opposite of noise. So here I'm using a very neutral definition. It actually comes very consistent with Shannon's information theory, but it's something I learned from my engineering colleagues. Basically, a quantity of anything that varies. That's what a signal is. And signals, some familiar signals would be a wavelength of light that hits your retina in one of your eyes, or vibration that moves the fluid in your inner ear and tickles the little hairs of your cochlea, or an action potential of a neuron. It could even be the action of a sodium-potassium pump on an axon. It could be something that's, that is happening in a mitochondrial organelle. It could be the concentration of cortisol in your blood. It could be the movements of a muscle. It could be the time display on a clock. It could be your facial movements. It could be fluctuating interest rates, really anything that varies. And signals by themselves have no inherent meaning. Kind of like the blobby bee image, or the blobby image that I showed you in lecture 2. So think of William James's description of the blooming buzzing confusion. Objective reality, so to speak, is just a bunch of signals that are not interacting with each other. But when they interact, something else happens, and that is that they constrain each other. So they're reducing complexity, so to speak, of what's possible, and new levels of organization emerge. And so this blooming, buzzing confusion becomes predictable moments of organization that create meaning, like our perception of the classical world of enduring objects, or what philosophers call entities. This is Carlo Rovelli's relational view of quantum mechanics, which I have to tell you, if you haven't read it, you should. You can try the technical papers. Good luck. I was only able to understand a tiny bit of those technical papers after I read the popular book that he wrote called Helgoland, which I think I've read probably 5 times. I found it very instructive and very helpful then to move on to the technical papers. This idea of signals constraining one another and reducing complexity to produce a coherence of some sort is also called contextual coherence. And I cannot remember this woman's first name. I can't even say her name. Does anyone know how to say that? Say again? Quaredo. Okay, I don't remember her first name. She's published 2 books. Dense, but worth it. So, for example, an electron, according to the relational view of quantum mechanics, which we think of as a basic building block of reality, is just the product, is basically emerges from a product of interacting signals. And when the signals briefly interact, the electron is there, and when they stop interacting, the electron is gone. And so this is a way of understanding, instead of thinking about an electron as a wave or as a particle or as probabilistically existing in multiple places, at multiple energy levels, the way Bohr talked about it in an atom, we think about it more as these moments of signal interaction, which produces from which the electron emerges, and then it dissolves. The chair that you're sitting on, which is made of atoms, which contains electrons, is also a product of interacting signals. Our thoughts and feelings and actions are also the product of interacting signals. Every instance of every category is a product of interacting signals. This is the position that I'm forwarding today. And so going forward, we should think not about entities, but as interacting signal events. So let's consider this general idea and how it applies. Do you want me to put that back? Did you want to take a picture? I'll do it. Yeah. I'm not sure where, is this what you wanted or? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So let's consider the idea and how it applies to during category construction. Each category begins as a set of signals, prediction signals. So these signals are a sample of possible futures. Because if you have one pattern of signals for functional abstract features, they will become decompressed into multiple possible sensory motor particulars. But the idea here is that prediction signals, as they decompress to these possible, probabilistically possible, different sensory motor futures, they constrain the meaning of incoming signals from the sensory surfaces of the body. At every synapse, it's happening that every synapse, so at every neuron, there is receiving signals that are closer to what's happening in the core of the brain, the sort of origin of the allostatic control signals, and also signals that are closer to the sensory periphery. We call them former prediction signals, we call the latter prediction error signals, but basically every neuron is integrating information, signals. Actually, it is information, it's creating mutual information, but I'm trying not to use any equations or discussion like formal information theory here. I'm just trying to give this to you in a more accessible, common set of ideas. And the result of the contextual constraints is a moment of coherence as signals become meaningful in relation to one another. So this is how the brain is solving the inverse problem. The features that result, which are the actions you take in your experience of the world, are properties of this constraint, this moment of constraint. They're features of signals in relation to one another. This is what I'm defining as relational meaning. So signals take on meaning when they interact with each other to produce the features that create reality and that we experience as the objective world. As an aside, I want you to notice what I'm suggesting here. Any signal's momentary meaning is always relative to any other signal it's interacting with. In psychology, this larger ensemble of signals is referred to as the situation or context. And typically context in psychology connotes epiphenomenal influences that might be weak or might modify or maybe slightly tweak the phenomenon of interest. And so an example would be, if you're studying visual processing, you're studying visual perception, all you have to do is study the signals that from the retina that make their way up to the visual system in the brain. And you don't have to study audition, and you don't have to study interoception, and you don't have to study olfaction. You don't have to study any of these things because they're all just context. And sure, maybe they might like slightly tweak, you know, what's going on in vision, but really they're like it's like an independent system. And what I'm suggesting, really more in line with ecological psychology and you know, other sorts of what I would call more relational ideas of brain function, is that these aren't actually contexts. These are, no matter how weak or ephemeral a signal might be, if it's interacting with another signal, it's part of the meaning of that. That's part of that. This is part of the meaning, the signal's meaning, basically. So in this relational view, context really refers to all the signals that interact to create any given event that we know as reality. Even relatively weak or ephemeral signals, the kind that psychologists and neuroscientists usually relegate to the background, can be important to a signal event, to a moment that we know of as reality. And this isn't just a philosophical musing. This is a principled philosophical basis for understanding what is going on in psychology right now. If you think that if your view is a more, what I would call traditional realist view, where there's a world out there, it's separate from you, you have ways of knowing that world, but only imperfectly, and that cause is very mechanistic in a kind of Newtonian way, then you should be able to take any method of any experiment, plop it into any lab with any sample of subjects and replicate the effect. And if you can't, you have a serious replication problem on your hands. But if you take a more relational, contextual view and you fail to replicate something, that means that there's a hidden causal factor that you have failed to identify. And you should try to figure out what it is. Because in order to really understand cause of any phenomenon, you have to know the entire signal ensemble. So really, instead of trying to control experiments to remove variance, you try to model variance. So an example of this dichotomy and how it played out historically in a science is in biology. And a really nice description of this is by Dick Lewontin, the evolutionary biologist who passed away recently. He wrote a book in 2000 called The Triple Helix. And he's got just some really great examples of the really serious mistakes that biologists made by assuming this kind of, traditional, I would say traditional realist view, real mechanistic view, instead of this more relational view. Although he didn't talk about relationalism, he talked about like systems and systems theory and things like that. So back to the main point. From the perspective of relational realism, your brain is a system of signals that create contextual coherence with signals coming in from the body and from the world, constraining them. And this is how the brain solves its inverse problem. And by constraint, I mean reducing signal complexity. So, if you have n signals in the world, then there are 2 to the n combinations of interactions that you could have. And when signals interact, they reduce the number of interactions that are then possible. And if you consider that more signals that are interacting is reducing that complexity more, then really what you're getting is the creation of meaning. And I have more to say about that, but I'm not going to because I have a talk to finish and you can ask a question about it later. So a moment of contextual coherence or constraint of variation or a moment of meaning making is a moment of reality. That's the claim. And this is what I mean when I say that reality is perceiver dependent. A signal only has meaning in relation to another signal when it's interacting with it. And if it's just fluctuating on its own independently, it has no meaning. So let's dig into this idea a little bit. So consider the color red. Conventionally, red is a feature of objects, of apples, of flowers, of lipsticks, of cherries or other fruit, of sports cars. My dining room is red. Common sense tells us that red is a fixed inherent property of objects that exist outside of us in some objective reality, and that we just merely detect red with our human retinas, assuming we have neurotypical retinas. And this, as you know, in philosophy, this outlook is called realism, and I'm calling this traditional realism to distinguish it from relational realism, which is the other idea that I'm talking about. So traditional realism is the idea that there's an outside world full of entities with inherent features like red. So red is a property of objects that exists separately from you. And you come to know this world, this reality, through various rational and empirical means. Relational realism, by contrast, is the view that red is a feature of the relationship between signals in the periphery and signals in the brain. So certain wavelengths of light reflect off a flower along with a bunch of other wavelengths of light. And these signal ensembles are detected by arrays of cones in a neurotypical retina. Signals from the retina then make their way to a neurotypical brain where they interact with other signals, and the result is the feature red. So red is not a feature of a flower, red is a feature of interacting signals. It's a feature of the relationship. So red is relationally real. So another example would be the velocity, a ball. If I throw a ball to you, the ball doesn't have velocity. Velocity is not a property of the ball. Velocity is a property of the ball in relation to something else. And its velocity changes depending on what that something else is. So the features that we think of as inherent to objects or events are actually inherent, or not inherent, they're emergent. They emerge from the interactions of signals. So everything is defined, it's just defined relative to something for a perspective, basically, of something. So what I'm saying here, I'm not saying that your experience of red is relationally real, which of course it is. I'm actually suggesting something more radical, right? That red itself as a feature, or as a category even of objects, is relationally real. Red is red, like every feature of that we ever talk about, emerges as a property of the interaction amongst signals. And so let's consider the parts of this relation that create red. So there are light waves, waves of light or frequencies of light in the world. There are signals from retinas and signals in the brain. As you know, in a neurotypical retina, there are 3 types of cones which, working together with signals in the brain, result in trichromatic color. And so we say the rose is red, even though red is not inherent to the rose, it's a function of that interaction. For animals that lack a particular cone, like dogs or bulls or rabbits or horses, the flower is not red. It's a kind of a muddy green-brown. Common sense or traditional realism suggests that the flower is objectively red and that other animals just can't see that objective reality. Relational realism suggests that red is not real for dogs. It's not part of the reality that that pertains to dogs. reality is perspective dependent, and red is not part of that reality for dogs. It's not part of reality for a dog. So I want you to notice something here that I think is really important to me anyways. If we hold the view that the flower is objectively red and other animals just can't see that objective reality, then we're implicitly defining objectivity by what is neurotypical for a human. And based on our best understanding of the neuroscience of color vision, any notion of objective reality has a hidden condition. It depends on what neurotypical humans share, which is 3 cones, plus certain types of signals in the brain. But here we're just talking about cones. The signals that are bouncing around in the neurotypical human retina are required for the existence of red or for any other feature that is supposed objective reality that we see. And when I talk about this hidden condition, that what is neurotypical for us, I'm saying that it's hidden because we experience reality as a given, and we don't, the dependence of objectivity on basically what is shared by neurotypical humans is sort of hidden to us in the same way that, Newtonian equations have also hidden parameters to them. They were hidden from Newton because they're held constant while we're on Earth talking about objects of a specific size. You don't have to think about these parameters because they're not part of the equations. It's really like they're there, but they're hidden, and he just didn't know about them. But when you start to think about objects of very, 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 very small size, or objects of very, 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 very large size, or objects that are far enough away from the Earth, then those parameters reveal themselves, right? And that's where you get, Newtonian, when you get the relativity, the equations of relativity, and then quantum mechanics. So this hidden condition that is objective reality basically depends on, or is conditional on, or is related to what all neurotypical humans share, I think is a really important insight, at least for me. So consider people with non-neurotypical retinas. They are missing a particular cone, the L cone, and therefore they experience the flower like this, as green, like a muddy green-brown rather than red. Some people have a 4th cone, allowing them to see 100 times the colors that someone with a neurotypical retina might see it. So would we say that people who have fewer cones or more cones, extra cones, fail to experience the flower objectively? If you answer yes, then you are accepting the idea that objective reality equals what neurotypical humans share. And if you reject that idea, that assumption, then you would conclude that reality created relationally is different for those people. You'd be relinquishing a cherished idea that all humans inhabit one single objective reality that is out there, independent of us. So, think about it. If neurotypical vision in humans, had more cones or fewer cones, then the flower would not be objectively red. If neurotypical humans had 5 cones, then that's what whatever the color is that we would see, that's what we would consider objective reality, right? It would be objectively some other color. So reality as it pertains to humans would be different. So red is not an enduring feature of an object. It's a feature of signals in relation to one another. So red is relationally real. And so is every other feature that emerges from interacting signals. The feature delicious is not lurking inside foods like dark chocolate, French fries, and crusty bread. Those are my favorite, pick your own. It's a feature of the relations between the molecules in those foods, the signals within your body, like signals from the bacteria that have colonized your gut, signals that are flying up the vagus nerve, signals from your taste buds, signals from your olfactory bulb, and so on. All of these signals are interacting with signals in the human brain. Likewise, paintings are not inherently beautiful, money is not intrinsically valuable, jokes are not intrinsically funny, particularly my jokes apparently. Snakes are not inherently threatening. Beauty, value, humor, and threat, these feel to us, we experience them as if they're in the world, but they're not in the world. They are not causal processes in a human mind. They are features of the relations between signals that necessarily include the signals that are part of your, make up your body and your brain. And I think this insight holds three important implications. First, as we learned in lecture 3, abstract features like value and pleasure and threat are multimodal summaries whose sensory and motor particulars have been compressed away. And compression occurs when many features of high dimensionality are summarized, redundancies removed into fewer features of lower dimensionality. And we talked about that, if you recall, along the principal architectural gradient of the cerebral cortex, but we also talked briefly about the fact that there are other compression gradients in the brain. And as a result, any multimodal summary corresponds to more than one pattern of high dimensional concrete sensory features. So I'm just repeating something I said before and we talked about yesterday. So the mental feature unpleasant affect is an ensemble of electrochemical signals that correspond to more than one high dimensional ensemble of concrete sensory and motor features, details. So the same functional feature manifests in different ensembles of concrete features in concrete mental features in different spatiotemporal instances. So this many to one, many sensory motor patterns to one multimodal summary is known as multiple realizability or degeneracy. We also talked about that. Different patterns of sensory and motor features share the same abstract feature in common. Which allows us to treat them as equivalent, right? So just like when we talked about the example of how babies use words, right? With the word is an abstract feature that is allowing them to treat sensory motor instances which are really different as having the same function. And then we can treat them as equivalent as part of the same category. And this allows us to generalize from prior instances that look different, sound different, taste different, require different motor movements, but we can generalize from them. And this arrangement affords us the ability to create meaning in a manner that transcends physical differences, supercharging a brain to generalize from the past and accumulate knowledge for future use in a really, really powerful way. The capacity to experience a concrete world of physical features in terms of non-observables, mental features, features that are only computed in the brain, is a hallmark of the mind. This is a quote from a recent paper by Feldman, developmental psychologist. And in lecture 3, we learned that abstract multimodal summaries are the first features that a brain reinstates during category construction. These are the features that become decompressed to become allostatic control signals, the signals that control the your autonomic nervous system, your immune system, your endocrine system, they become compressed to control your skeletal motor system, and they become decompressed. They become decompressed as sensory prediction signals. And we're talking about computations that are happening in every synapse, right? So a single pattern of multimodal features can become any one of multiple patterns of sensory motor particulars. This confers flexibility, and it also offers us the opportunity to forage for new information, because we will be wrong often, and we will have the opportunity to learn something new. And I think this is one way. It's just, maybe it's just another way of saying how our understanding of predictive processing in our lab is different from this notion of having to minimize prediction error. What you want to do is minimize the cost, make it efficient as possible to learn new information. Because it's the efficiency that's going to determine whether you can and whether you are healthy. And actually whether you can have children and whether they will survive, and basically the survival of the species. Evolutionary biologists are super clear about this. A major selection pressure is metabolic efficiency, not reducing costs, reducing needless waste. Now, these multimodal compressed summaries are also the basis of social reality, as we discussed in lecture 2. So social reality is relationally real pretty much in the same way as red. So normally we think about social reality as different from physical reality, but what I'm trying to suggest is they're both relational in pretty much the same way. A second implication here is that all neurotypical human brains develop to make abstract features. So brains are born with the architecture to make abstract features, and that architecture, the tuning and pruning that happens in early development, is really enhancing the capacity for brains to make these features. But which features they make will partly depend on prior events that they have been exposed to, that are the wiring instructions that happen during brain development. So as we receive wiring instructions from the world and the body, our own bodies, each of us learns when and how to treat different context-specific sensory motor patterns as functionally equivalent. This learning is transmitted from generation to generation during development via the processes that scientists call socialization. By words and by the actions of other people, along with the conditions of our own bodies, these events basically are create the signal events that recur and are learned by the brain, and then reinstated by the brain later as memory or as prediction signals. So basically, when there are statistical learning, when patterns recur in the periphery, in the body and in the world, what the brain is learning to do is it's learning to impose functional similarities on a variety of more concrete signal patterns that arise from the natural and cultural ecology of a person's environment. And a brain learns to compress signal ensembles, I think, to construct the abstract features of its culture, which then aids in the transmission of concepts across generation by epigenetic means, which is what evolutionary biologists like Richardson and Boyd call cultural inheritance. So, for the most part, this is the third implication, the features that we think about as concrete in the world are actually abstract mental features. They're just not as abstract as things like anger or justice or what have you. But they themselves are abstract and functional. The color red, for example, is an abstract feature constructed as conceptual coherence in the brains of people with the necessary ingredients. who have learned to treat a range of different wavelengths of light as equivalent as red, for example, depending on the prior experiences and the words and actions of other people in your culture. So we impose a functional similarity on variable signal ensembles to create red. So for red to be real, your brain must be able to assemble an abstract feature for red in interaction with the signals from your neurotypical retina. So what would happen if your brain couldn't make a concept for red, couldn't make this feature, this abstract feature for red? Well, I'm going to argue that, well, then red would not exist in reality, in the reality as it pertains to you. Now, I can't demonstrate this for you because how many of you can see red? Okay, so you have a concept and that can make red, so your brain can make signal ensembles, and it's very, 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 very hard to keep you from doing that. Right, we have methods that allow us to do that, and they work for about 600 or 700 milliseconds. So it's just like really, it's very, very hard because it's all happening very quickly. So, but what I can do is I can prompt your brain to make a concept for red when there are no wavelengths of light between 650 and 750 nanometers that are hitting your retina. You ready? Okay, so by the way, I got this example off of TikTok. Okay, there's and if anybody wants me to send, there's the link. If you want me to send it to you, I'm really happy to do it. This is not my example. I just saw it and I was like, this is amazing. I'm going to use this in a talk. I might even write a whole talk just to use this example. So here is a photograph of a traffic light. So who sees the top light as red? Awesome. Okay, now here are the lights again, this time with a cyan filter over them. Who sees the top light as red? Right. Wavelengths of light between 600 and 750 nanometers cannot pass through a cyan filter. Yet you are still seeing red. Why? Because, whoops, let me do it. Sorry, I did that too fast. Because the signals in your brain actually were making an embodied concept, which created red in the absence of light of the relevant wavelengths from your retina. As you can see here, it's gray, right? For those of us with neurotypical retinas, it's gray. So the instance of red was created in that moment, or actually for who has it gone back to red now? What's really cool is if you stare at the gray one for long enough, when you take away the gray boxes, it stays gray for a little while, but then it goes back to red. And I was playing around with this, trying to, when I'm supposed to be writing a talk, trying to figure out is there any relationship between how long I stare at the gray and how long it takes for the, so I don't know, but that's an interesting experiment. But what I want to say here is that the instance of red here is created in exactly the same way as the vibrations that you heard or felt during the video of the jumping electrical towers in lecture 3, or whoever here has had like a song going through their head that they seriously can't get out of their head no matter what they try to do. I mean, right? Okay. These are simulations in the brain, which we would also call prediction signals. We would also call them perceptual inference. I'm telling you that they originate as compressed features, although the compressed feature for red is not as compressed and not as abstract as other features that we talked about. So, but the interesting thing here is for humans who don't culturally inherit the reality of red, say the Dani people of Papua New Guinea, who only have 2 color categories, which reflect light and dark, the flower reflecting light at 650 nanometers is not red. Common sense suggests that the flower is objectively red to us and that the Dani just can't see it. But that, I would say, is naive realism. Objectivity, as you will recall, is secretly defined by the consensus amongst humans. And so to repeat, objectivity is conditional. It's inherently relational. So it exists, it just exists in relation. So ultimately, the implication here is that there is one perspective-dependent reality with many kinds of human minds. Meaning, if you have different concepts wired into your brain, then the reality as it pertains to you will share with other people who can make those concepts, or any human who can do conceptual combination to take what the concepts they can make and make new concepts, just like we did with the jumping electrical towers, right? Now, I appreciate the fact that this is really, really hard to accept. Like, as I'm looking out into the audience, I see people, you guys are doing exactly what I do when I'm thinking really hard, and I'm not really sure if I'm buying what I'm hearing, but I'm thinking really hard. There are people who are looking to the left and some people looking to the right who are just staring off into space, you know, which I often will do without realizing it. My husband will say, you know, like, are you with me here? Are you come back to the, you know, present? So to me, that's a good sign because you're thinking about what I'm saying. Because this idea, right, that objectivity is conditional, it so violates common sense. But I think this is a testament to the power of concepts for creating reality. Category of construction, when it's working properly, is completely invisible to us most of the time, no matter how many cones we have. The fact that objective reality is conditioned on a hidden consensus amongst humans means that, you know, provocatively, it means that what we think of as physically real out there in the world, but also the things that we create and add to the world in social reality really are emerging from the same process. So if that's not provocative enough for you, then think about what this means about literally objects. It's common sense to think that flowers exist in the world in reality, separate to us, right? You can pick up a flower, you can buy a flower, you can receive a flower as a gift or as an honorific symbol. You can sometimes eat a flower, right? You can use a flower as a weapon. I mean, you can do a lot of things with flowers. They're real, right? Common sense tells us that we group flowers together by their nature in reality, not by our goals or interests or concepts. A flower is a flower because it exists in the world. Okay, but if you were an ant, what we call a flower would really just simply be terrain to climb over. And if you were a whale, the flower would be invisible to you. It would be completely irrelevant, just not in your ecological niche. And if you were an imaginary creature of subatomic size, a flower would actually not exist at all. It would mostly just be empty space. A relational view of reality asks us to deny simple basic assumptions about the nature of reality, that reality doesn't exist as things, as entities. It's constituted as dynamically interacting signal events. Each moment of interaction is an event. An electron is an interaction among signals, according to Carlo Rovelli and other colleagues of his. But I'm suggesting so is a flower, and so are you. the signals that constitute an electron change quickly, as we've learned from quantum mechanics, but the signals that constitute a flower or you or the chair interact on a time scale that we perceive as constant because that we experience it as constant. So this explanation is very simplified, but it captures the notion that categories don't exist as enduring universal groupings of enduring objective entities with inherent features that are out there in the world, separate from us. Categorizing, in a sense, is not involved in detecting regularities, but in constructing those regularities, constructing categories to create meaning as unfolding signal events, creating what we experience as reality, or actually creating reality is a better way to put it. So category construction constrains the meaning of incoming signals, sensory signals, in a particular situation, rendering that event meaningful from a particular perspective in terms of a particular function. And this is how interacting ensembles of signals become a plant, how a plant becomes a flower or a weed or food or a weapon. This is how a scowl, this is how, facial movements become a scowl. It's how a scowl can express anger or concentration or discomfort or humor. In relational realism, an instance of anything emerges as an event in which signals interact and constrain each other. This includes not just objects, but every psychological phenomenon. An instance of anger is an event. It's constructed as signals in your brain, which we learned are prediction signals or concepts that interact with signals from the brain, from the world, and from the body that hit the sensory surfaces of your body. These signal interactions give rise to features like offense, unpleasantness or pleasantness, like scowling or smiling or crying, like telling a joke with the intention of shaming someone, of being absolutely sure that the other person is like a complete idiot, right? These are all features that we construct and then embed essentially in what we consider objective reality. But they're really features of relations. This is hard. I mean, when I'm driving on the highway and someone cuts me off, I am not experiencing that person as an asshole, as like an emerging feature of like an interaction between me and that person. I am pretty sure it's just that person. But, brains are miraculous things. So what I'm suggesting here is that categorization is at the core of reality. I put that with a question mark because every time I just couldn't write it down without the question. I think this is logically correct, but it's, conditional. So when you act on an object or an event, you are treating it like something else. You're categorizing. So categorizing doesn't have to be, in the traditional way that we run experiments where we, ask people to group things together mentally. When you're remembering something, you're categorizing. When you feel something, when you make a decision, when you even imagine something, you're constructing a category. A change in heart rate, a change in inflammatory chemicals, digestion, vomiting even, are all a kind of categorization. If you act in the same way towards things which are sensory, have different sensory properties, you can describe that as categorization. I don't think that's overgeneralizing. I think that's useful because, it's an abstraction. So in the West, we typically think of action and perception and memory and so on as categories of separate events. But what I'm suggesting is that they're different perspectives on a common process, and they are features that are constructed, abstract features that are constructed during an instance of categorization. So every instance in the brain of categorization involves memory, perception, features of perception, features of feeling, and so on. They are mental features of a brain state. Whether we consider them to be features of the brain state or categories describing the brain state depends on the extent to which they are functionally relevant in the situation. So red can be a feature or it can be a category, depending on what's relevant to the situation. And I should say, these are the mental features of a brain that's been wired in the West. Right? They don't necessarily, it's not necessarily for all neurotypical humans. Okay, why is this not real idealism? Idealism is the claim, I'm telling this to a bunch of philosophers, I realize the irony. Idealism is a claim that reality is only in your head. Relational realism is the claim that reality depends on the relation between signals, some of which are necessarily in your head. Experience here is beside the point. I'm not saying you have to experience something for it to be real. I'm saying you have to interact with it. The signals that make up you have to interact with the signals. You don't have to be aware of it. You don't have to experience it. There has to be a signal interaction. So can something exist in reality if it doesn't interact with your signals? If it doesn't affect the signals that are part of you, I don't think so. So for example, if you have a tumor that you don't experience in any way consciously, but that tumor cell is affecting other cells in your body, like for example, competing for oxygen consumption, then the tumor exists in reality as it pertains to you, even though you're not experiencing. It's about whether something affects you, a signal affects your signals. It's not about whether you experience it. So what about neutrinos that pass through your body undetected? Well, before their discovery, neutrinos were not part of human reality. They don't interact with you at all. But when they were discovered, reality, as it pertains to humans, expanded. What about dark matter? Well, we interacted with dark matter in mathematics. We had concept for it. So and then we went looking for it in reality, the reality that we are part of. And we can detect it as anomalies in signals that we can detect. So we don't know what dark matter is, but we can detect it as an anomaly in something, in signals that do interact with us. And that's how it's part of the reality that's relevant to us. I could go on and on, but I want to finish up quickly. This view is also not empiricism. It's not logical empiricism. It's not constructive. It's not constructive empiricism. Empiricism, as you know, is the position that we can only know the part of reality that we experience directly. But in relational realism, you don't have to experience something for it to be real, as I've just said. And also every direct experience you have involves concepts and categories. So you never experience anything directly. Concepts are, you're not supposed to, well, I don't have to explain to you what empiricism is, So to wrap up, I'm just gonna make 5 quick points and then I just want to end with a story. Short. Based on my best understanding as a neuroscientist and psychologist, reality is relational. It's a complex web of variable interacting signals that momentarily constrain each other, producing events of relational meaning. Reality is perspective dependent. A signal only has meaning in relation to other signals it's interacting with. So reality is constituted precisely out of the signals that your signals interact with. And you can detect these signals directly or indirectly by way of other signals. Either way, we humans participate in everything that is a part of reality as it pertains to us, because the signals in our bodies and our brains are part of the ensemble of relations from which reality emerges. So reality as it pertains to us is perspective dependent, or perceiver dependent. A perceiver independent reality that pertains to us would not exist, doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. Categorization is at the core of what's real. I'm, you know, not gonna repeat what I'm just like beating a drum that I've already probably made you tone deaf already, so I'm gonna stop right there, but the idea here that I really just wanna get across is that social reality and physical reality, the things that we take to be physical reality, pretty much work the same way. What we call objective reality is conditioned on consensus. Just like social reality is based on consensus, both are conditioned on what humans share. And this is often a hidden component of what we call objective. And in theories of the mind, what we think of as a mental category is really a mental event, a whole brain event, a brain state with mental features. There are no mental states. Mental states do not exist. Brain states exist with mental features. So I'm not denying the mind. I'm saying the mind is an event that emerges in a brain in interaction, the signals in interaction with other signals. And mental features are features of equivalence that make up these ad hoc categories that by which we describe a mind. So the end, I just briefly want to share this, just a snippet of a story about the relational nature of reality, specifically as it pertains to the mind. This comes to us from a book called Naming the Mind from the historian Kurt Danziger. He's a historian of psychology. Danziger once visited a university. This is in the opening chapter of his book. He visited a university in Indonesia. He was on sabbatical and went to Indonesia with the intention of teaching a course in psychology. He was raised and educated in the West on a steady diet of folk psychology topics and categories that organize, you know, any introductory psychology textbook, cognitions, emotions, perceptions, and so on. On his arrival, he learned that there was a course of this kind already existing with its roots, and I'm quoting him here, in Hindu philosophy with Javanese additions and reinterpretations. So this was completely new to him. But, and this is quoting, I'm quoting him here now. But whereas my subject matter was identified on the timetable as psychology, my colleague in the department was identified as teaching the Indonesian equivalent, which, how do you say this? Do you?
Ilmu jiwa.
Ilmu jiwa, okay. And which is a psychology of a different sort. Now, initially, Danziger took this to be a local variant of kind of a universal psychology. And again, quote, in quoting him, well, I'll quote him in a second. He suggested that the current instructor who was teaching this other course, that they teach a joint seminar so they could explain our approach to this using to the same set of psychological topics, followed by an analysis of our differences. He reasoned, if both my Indonesian colleague and I were dealing with psychological reality, there ought to be some points of contact and even convergence in our domains. So the idea was they would identify a set of common topics and then they would analyze them, similarities and their differences. And then he writes, to my utter surprise, we didn't agree on a single topic. For instance, I wanted to discuss the topic of motivation. His counterpart, however, said that that would be quite difficult because from his point of view, motivation was not really a topic. The phenomenon and again, this is Danziger, the phenomenon that I quite spontaneously grouped together as motivation, the phenomena that I grouped together as motivation seemed to him to be no more than a heterogeneous collections of things that had nothing of interest in common. I tried other topics, lamented Danziger, intelligence, learning, and so on, but my colleague would not recognize any of them as domains clearly marked off from other domains. He granted that each of them had some common features, but he regarded these as trivial or artificial or arbitrary. In the other direction, the psychology topics suggested by my Indonesian colleague were not only unfamiliar to me, I found the description hard to follow. They didn't seem to me to constitute natural domains. Ultimately, they just abandoned the effort to try to identify ideas to hold a joint seminar. So what Danziger was describing were incommensurate psychologies. Basically, the categories were incomparable, so there was no clear way to translate from one to the other. They were basically speaking different conceptual languages. Now, if Danziger was a traditional realist, he would have assumed that his Western categories were the right categories, described by genes as part of a universal human nature, wired into the brain before birth, or maybe even at birth, but still. He might have argued that the Indonesian categories were a mere cultural variant on a common core set of universal categories. That is what people argue in the science of emotion. There are a core basic set of categories, and anything else you see is a cultural variant. And presumably his Indonesian counterpart, if he was a traditional realist, would make an analogous argument about the Western categories. But that's not what happened. Instead, Danziger realized that, and to quote him, it was clearly possible to carve up the field of psychological phenomena in a very different way and still end up with a set of concepts that seem quite natural given the appropriate cultural context. Moreover, these different sets of concepts could each make perfect practical sense. In experimental settings, these concepts could be employed to produce specific psychological phenomena as reliably, perhaps more reliably, than many of our psychological experiments. He wrote that in 1979. The effect or basically what Danziger is arguing here about psychological categories is that they're relational kinds instead of natural kinds. So what this story tells us is that a single flexible human brain architecture can make a variety of type of human minds when the signals are in constant interaction with the situation, the context. Not an infinite number of human minds, because there are embodiment constraints, right? But definitely more than one. People in different cultures can make different concepts, and reality as it pertains to them might be different from ours when we in a culture where we have, right, not completely different, right, but somewhat different. And I'm not saying, well, I have my reality and you have your reality, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm really trying to make this a principled argument as a form of realism. This is not anti-realism. There is not one single human nature, but many human natures within one flexible relational reality. Thank you.